In this lecture on Chapter 12, we will focus exclusively on Neanderthals, but it's important for you to read about the other hominid species that were present during this time, especially Homo floresiensis. So Neanderthals are a group that eventually evolved in Europe. Researchers know a tremendous amount about the Neanderthals. They are among some of the very first discovered hominid fossils, which were discovered in the mid-1800s. Their fossils have been found in well-preserved, well-studied cave localities in Europe, and fortunately for preservation purposes, there's evidence that they buried their dead, so their remains were not scavenged by carnivores and could remain more or less intact. As we've already discussed, the climate fluctuated chaotically during the Pleistocene, though there was a gradual cooling trend. As shown in this graph taken from an ice core in northern Greenland, the oxygen isotope ratio has fluctuated wildly over the course of the last 120,000 years. The two endpoints of the graph represent two interglacials, including the present one. Notice that even during an ice age, there's temperature fluctuation. Nevertheless, during this overall cool period of the Pleistocene, the glaciers expanded throughout northern Eurasia and North America. With so much water trapped in ice, the sea levels dropped, forming land bridges between Asia and North America and connecting much of the Indonesian archipelago. South of the Eurasian glaciers was a vast, frigid grassland occupied by mammoths, reindeers, woolly rhinoceroses, horses, oxen, and the Neanderthals. The first Neanderthal was discovered in 1856 when workers at a quarry in western Germany found some very strange bones. Anatomists studied them and declared them to be a population of extinct humans, but other scholars regarded them to be pathological modern people, an interpretation that held sway for some time. However, increasing numbers of these strange bones were discovered throughout the late 1800s, and eventually it was recognized that there was once a group of now extinct humans living in glacial Europe, the Neanderthals. But what is unique about the anatomy of this extinct human population? First, Neanderthals had gigantic brains. The average size was 1,520 cubic centimeters, and the largest is 1,740 cubic centimeters. This is larger than Homo heidelbergensis and even larger than the average Homo sapiens. Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. The skulls are also shaped differently. Humans have very round skulls shaped like a soccer ball. Neanderthals, on the other hand, had oblong skulls shaped like footballs with a sloping forehead and a bulge in the back of the skull, which is called an occipital bun. Neanderthals also had large projecting faces with a well-developed brow ridge and very large nasal cavities. Finally, Neanderthals' teeth were distinct. They had large, heavily worn incisors, which may have been used to work hides or pull meat. There are large scratches on their incisors that indicate that Neanderthals held meat in their teeth while slicing it with a stone tool. It's interesting that the direction of these scratches indicates that most Neanderthals were right-handed. Finally, the molars of Neanderthals had an expanded pulp cavity, which caused the roots to expand and sometimes merge. These are called pterodont roots. From the neck down, Neanderthals were not that different from you or I. However, like those of earlier hominids, the bones of Neanderthals were robust. These were quite muscular people, short and stocky with large joints and more extensive muscle attachments, especially in the shoulders. Compared to modern Europeans, Neanderthals were on the left on the slide. They were shorter but about 30% heavier. They had large torsos but shorter arms and legs. Why was this the case? It's hypothesized that this body form is an adaptation that's beneficial for retaining body heat in cold climates, and this is explained on the next slide. This slide shows the relationship between the mean annual temperature, which is the y-axis, and the crural index, which is the x-axis, for several populations of humans, including Neanderthals. The crural index is a ratio of the tibia length to the femur length. Populations living in colder climates, like Neanderthals and modern people living within the Arctic Circle, have lower crural indices or shorter tibiae. Why is this the case? Heat loss is a function of an organism's surface area. The more surface area is exposed to the air, the more heat can be lost. For a given volume, an individual can reduce the relative amount of surface area by either increasing overall body size or reducing the size of the limbs. Longer-limbed individuals have a higher ratio of surface area to volume and therefore can disperse heat more easily. This body type is adaptive in populations living close to the equator. Shorter-limbed individuals have a lower ratio of surface area to volume, a body type that is more adaptive for populations living farther from the equator. In addition to these biological adaptations, Neanderthals likely dealt with cold climate culturally by wearing clothes. There's a stereotypic image of Neanderthals as being brutish dimwits, and this is not supported by actual evidence that's been collected on them. Whether they could speak or not is controversial, and there's evidence on both sides of the argument. But researchers have found a fossilized hyoid bone, which we last discussed in the context of Australopithecus. Remember that the hyoid was similar to the chimpanzees in shape with Australopithecus, suggesting they could not talk. The hyoid bone in Neanderthals, however, looked just like that of modern humans. However, the base of the skull was different, and the range of sounds that Neanderthals could have made was probably less than for modern humans. Regardless, Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do, and there's plenty of evidence that they could construct sophisticated stone tools for big game hunting. Mysterian industry tools, which is a type of Mode 3 prepared core tool, are found at Neanderthal sites, as are bones of large animal prey like deer and bison. It's important to note that the bones of these prey animals are not just from the vulnerable, but also composed of prime-aged adults. This is the demographic that would be expected if these animals were being hunted or driven off cliffs. Many Neanderthal sites are in caves. Though there is some evidence that Neanderthals used these caves as home bases, one must remember that this kind of site is likely to better preserve bones and tools than an open-air site. This means that Neanderthals might have preferred to live elsewhere, but the evidence was not preserved in those areas. There is no evidence at any of these Neanderthal localities that they built shelters. However, there's plenty of evidence that they buried their dead. Many sites in France preserve a pattern of geology that's consistent with deliberate burial of the dead. Exactly why they buried their dead is unclear. Some think that it's because it was a ceremonial act, while others think that maybe they were just disposing of decaying carcasses to keep scavengers away from their home bases. Regardless of whether burying of their dead was a symbolic act, while they were alive, Neanderthals certainly engaged in symbolic behavior. For example, recent discoveries in southeastern Spain demonstrate that Neanderthals wore necklaces. These shells, approximately 50,000 years old, have been deliberately stained with an orange pigment and perforated so that they could be hung on a string. High concentrations of red ochre at some Neanderthal sites suggest the use of body pigmentation as well. Clearly, Neanderthals were as interested in self-ornamentation as modern humans. Evidence from bones and teeth in Neanderthals indicate that they lived short, difficult lives. There's evidence that Neanderthals lived far beyond the age of 45. Yet the skeletons of these individuals are often heavily arthritic and show signs of an extremely difficult life. The teeth are often worn down and present evidence of gum disease. Healed fractures are quite common in Neanderthal skeletons as well. For instance, the individual shown here is Ch12, a Neanderthal male found in a cave in Iraq in the 1950s. He suffered a blow to his left eye that crushed his eye orbit and probably rendered him blind in that eye. He also had a severely withered right arm and an arthritic ankle. Though Ch12 may be an extreme example, many Neanderthal skeletons are pathological, indicating that life was quite tough for these hominids. It's interesting, though, that some of these injuries are so severe that researchers hypothesize that Neanderthals must have taken care of one another, allowing the injuries of these individuals to heal and therefore allowing them to survive. This idea of caring for another individual, known as conspecific care, may well have predated the origins of modern humans. So we've made it through the Middle Pleistocene, and along the way, you've read about Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, the hobbits, which is Homo floresiensis, and you've learned about Neanderthals. But what about us? What about Homo sapiens? To answer that question, we have to return to Africa. When we last discussed African hominids, it was in the context of a large large-faced hominid, Homo heidelbergensis, or that's what you read about. But fossil evidence from South Africa, Tanzania, and Ethiopia indicates that between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis evolved into our own species, Homo sapiens. The skulls shown here are difficult to categorize, which is precisely what one would expect during a period when one species is evolving into another. They both are large-brained, like Homo heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens. The face is larger and the skull is more robust in modern humans, but less robust than in Homo heidelbergensis. It's interesting that they do not show any of the unique Neanderthal features we've just examined. In fact, no Neanderthal fossils have ever been found in Africa. Yet, genetic studies of Neanderthal DNA, specifically mitochondrial DNA, have revealed that Neanderthals are very genetically similar to modern humans. We'll look at more fossils in more detail in the next chapter, but for now, it's important to recognize that fossils that increasingly resemble Homo sapiens begin to crop up in Africa in sediments around 200,000 years ago. And that concludes this chapter's summary.